それでは本日のプログラムを開始いたします。はじめに OpenStack コーファウンダー OpenStack Foundation COO マーク・コリア様より How OpenStack is developed A New Way for a New World と題しご講演をいただきます。なお当セッションでは同時通訳がございます。チャンネル1番で日本語をお聞きいただけます。同通レシーバーがお手元にない方はお配りいたしますので挙手をお願いいたします。それではマーク・コリア様よろしくお願いいたします。
Is that better? All right. Good morning again, everyone. Mark Collier with the OpenStack Foundation. I'm very excited to be here. Was lucky enough to be at this event 1 year ago, and hopefully many of you came, but I know this event has more than doubled, so a lot of new faces. And one of the things we love more than anything is seeing the OpenStack community grow, getting more people involved. Today's theme for today and tomorrow for this event is about the expanding OpenStack ecosystem. However, I thought that I would talk a little bit about users and how users are actually becoming more actively engaged in how software gets written that they rely on. And throughout this event, you'll be hearing from many of the companies that are very strong and very involved in the OpenStack ecosystem. But I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about how the world is changing for users of software. This is a quote that many of you may have heard. It's Mark Andreessen. He was the creator of Netscape, and now he's a very successful investor. The quote was from a Wall Street Journal article about 3 years ago. And he said, "Software is eating the world." Has anyone heard this line? So I thought it was quite insightful, very good article, and his basic thesis was that software is becoming so important to essentially every single company. It's actually becoming strategic to every company. Companies you wouldn't think about as software companies. You might not think about them as tech companies. Companies like in healthcare, but also agriculture, finance, retail. There's really no industry that's not being affected by these massive changes. And this was 3 years ago. I think that we all know what some of the big trends are that are driving this. Billions of mobile phones, and we know that that's a huge driver of data and insights, and that's one of the reasons why it's affecting every industry. The Internet of Things is kind of the latest buzzword. Anyone heard of this, Internet of Things? It's really the idea that everyday devices will be connected to the internet, whether it's a fitness device on your arm to see how much you're walking or jogging or looking at your pulse, or the thermostat in your house. But more and more pieces of data are being generated and stored. And this is why software is strategic to every business moving forward. And of course, cloud computing is a huge part of this movement. This is a photo from one of our OpenStack summits, which we have twice a year, where our community comes together to talk about OpenStack cloud computing. And of course, the plummeting cost of resources. I mean, if you look at some of the statistics quoted by Mark in his original article, he mentions that in order to host one of the early cloud companies, Loud Cloud, it was $150,000 a month in US dollars to manage their web presence. And 10 years later, it was 100 times cheaper. So this is a massive change in economics that open up opportunities for every small company, but also impact what's possible for large companies. And if you look at 3 years later, I think it's pretty clear that Mark was on the right track. This is a headline from a recent article which talks about the fact that some very traditional non-technology, non-software companies are actually acquiring startups. One of the biggest agricultural farming companies has acquired a technology startup. And one of the things that is mentioned in this article is that, in keeping with kind of where Mark was going with his thesis, is that these companies, their motivation was adding software, talent, and technologies. And we'll talk a little bit about talent and how this affects this movement to users becoming more active, and essentially every company looking at software as a fundamental part of how they create value. So if you buy into this idea that software is now strategic to every company on the planet, this really does change everything. It changes how software is produced and consumed. It changes how we view competitors and what the metrics of success are. It certainly changes the vendor-customer relationship, which is why I thought it would be good here this week, while we're talking about the expanding ecosystem, to look at it from the user's point of view. It's actually a great time to be a company who is actively engaged in building and managing an OpenStack cloud, for example, or using that as part of their software solution because of this ecosystem that's so strong. They're really in the driver's seat, and I think that's a big part of how software is changing over time. And again, the war for technical talent. In the technology world, it's always been the case that trying to get the best and brightest to your company was one of the top priorities. Well, if every company, even farm companies, finance companies, they're also looking for the top tech talent, that makes that even hotter of an issue for people. And the reason why I believe fundamentally that the old model of just simply buying software off the shelf doesn't work anymore for these areas which are strategic for your business is because you cannot buy strategic in a box. The things that are strategic to your company, you have to have experts on staff. You have to have your own strategy for how you're going to be adding value in your individual industry. And that's not going to come from a packaged software from one company. Of course, there's still many situations in which you may buy software in a box, so to speak. If you're talking about hosting email and back office applications and fundamental things that are tactics for running any business. But in the areas in which software is becoming strategic to how you differentiate your company, that's not going to work. And this is my opinion, certainly open to debate, but I think the old passive consumption model is broken. I think that's a model in which some other company is ultimately really making the strategic decisions about the platform that you're betting your business on. And you as a user, if you're engaging with that one company who's making all the decisions about the roadmap, you're lucky if you ever get to talk to a developer. You're so disconnected from how the software is being made that's actually fundamental to your business that's concerning. You may talk to your sales folks at the company. They may periodically update product management at that company. Eventually that makes its way into requirements. And maybe 2 or 3 years down the road, the feature you really needed to be competitive in whatever industry you're in, maybe comes out, and you see that with quite a lag, but you're really not in control of your destiny. And again, I'm not talking about all software. There's plenty of areas where back office software that every business needs to run, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, but where software is becoming strategic in your business, I think that there's a better way, and we're seeing some examples of this that I want to run through today. This is kind of how we look at the universe in the OpenStack world, which is an open design model. So people, I think, are familiar with open source, meaning you can download the software for free, you can reuse it, modify it. But a big part of how we develop OpenStack is actually open design, which means that much earlier in the process, it's completely open to anyone who wants to get involved and help decide what should go in the product, essentially weigh in on where the roadmap should go. this is very powerful, and it does require more commitment, more resources. It's a different way of engaging for a lot of companies, but the ones that are taking the step to become active users are seeing huge benefits. And I believe the companies that don't take that step are going to be left behind. And if you're a company in the ecosystem, this might seem scary. All of your customers armed with tons of information, really wanting to drive their own destiny, but I think that it's the right way for software to be developed. And we see this large number of users who are very active in these different phases coming together from all over the world. In the case of OpenStack, I was using as an example, because it's so freely available and there's so many ways you can get the software from different companies in the ecosystem, excuse me, it really has spread globally. So we have users all over the world. And when you think about that user community, a lot of people think about OpenStack or any software solution kind of based on who the vendors are that are driving it. But we actually have been amazed at how many of our users who want to solve a business problem, they want to install OpenStack, they want to do a cloud transformation project so they can be more agile, so they can differentiate as they develop software because it's strategic in their industry. How many of those companies are actually contributing back to OpenStack? So this is 50 of our users who could have just taken the software and gone off and used it as it was, but they found some way to contribute, whether it was documentation or fixing a bug or adding a feature that they needed, and they shared it back. So this is pretty phenomenal. I mean, if you think about a traditional proprietary software world, do the customers ever change the code? I mean, they don't even have access to the actual source code, but they certainly wouldn't be allowed to add a feature. I mean, that's just a completely different way of doing business. And these active users are quite happy and successful with OpenStack. So another characteristic of the active user is that they're very connected. So this is an example of some of our OpenStack ambassadors who got together from different countries around the world who are users and represent users from different countries. And they all know each other, they share best practices, they talk about where they want OpenStack to go. And so these users are very much empowered to demand what they want out of the software platform that is strategic to their business. They're also vocal. We have a number of big users who've come to the OpenStack summits and talked about what they're doing with OpenStack. A few that I mentioned here were Comcast, which is a large media company. In the US, they own NBC, which is the producer of the Olympics going on right now, so a very large media company and broadband company that's transforming the way they do business through OpenStack. And really because of being an active user, regardless if it was OpenStack or any other software project that they felt was strategic to them. Best Buy, a large retailer, and Bloomberg, which is a large financial company you may be familiar with. And so as we look back at those predictions from Mark Andreessen about how every industry would be affected by this and every company would become a software company, that's definitely what's happening. We think this active user is the way it's happening. A couple of other examples of the new next generation of users out there that are actually involved in creating and getting what they need out of software and not just taking it off the shelf. This is Tim Bell from CERN. How many of you are familiar with CERN? CERN? So they have the Large Hadron Collider, which is this giant, I'm not a physicist, so I may get this slightly wrong, but it's a giant atom smasher, basically, that's many, many miles long, largest in the world, I believe in Switzerland. And they are working on discovering the secrets to the origins of the universe, so big, big problems they're trying to solve. And so he's responsible for running thousands of servers, and they're analyzing massive many petabytes of data that are coming out of the Large Hadron Collider to try to come up with some conclusions from all this scientific research. And Tim is a great example of somebody who feels passionate about making this solution work for him, but also sharing it. He's actually leading the OpenStack User Committee, which is a group we formed to make sure that users have a strong voice in the direction of OpenStack. We also have an ongoing survey, which we have been running for over a year, that's informed many of the features that have gone into the last 2 releases of OpenStack. And he's been a big contributor to that. He's organized meetups where other users can come and speak and meet each other and get connected. In fact, he organized a meetup at the Large Hadron Collider, which I really wish I'd been able to go to, because that's pretty amazing. That's a picture of it down there. It's a pretty crazy machine, but he's analyzing all this data that's coming out of this, and he's also been to many of our summits. For those of you who don't know a little bit about how OpenStack is organized or how we make decisions, we do have a summit twice a year, which is where we plan the next release of the OpenStack software. So every 6 months, a new version is released, and 2 to 3 weeks later, we get together and we decide what's going to be in the next release. So having active users attend the summits, speak, and bring their requirements, and in some cases bring code, very valuable, and I think it's a lot of what you'll see, how you'll see software being built in the future. Another user who spoke in our most recent summit in Hong Kong, his name is Guillaume Abouchon, and he's with a company called Digital Film Tree. This is another example of someone who's changing their industry. And OpenStack is just a tool, it's a community that's part of what he's doing, but what's really interesting to me about it is actually how actively engaged he is in talking to other film studios, figuring out the whole supply chain of when video content comes off the cameras live on the set, how do they move it into production houses digitally in a cloud computing environment, ultimately all the way through until it gets to a network and is actually broadcast on TV. This is disrupting the entire television industry, what he's working on. And OpenStack is one of those tools that he's using, but the fact that he's engaged with his competitors, with other studios, with other companies in the supply chain, and trying to figure out how to stop doing things in silos and mailing cans of film or hard drives and actually moving things digitally is a big part of someone who's realizing that vision that Mark Andreessen laid out 3 years ago. His production company is responsible for some of the largest, most popular television shows in America. I don't know if Modern Family means anything to you, but it's quite a popular show in the US. And I think the knowledge and the disruption that's happening in this industry is exactly what we will see all over the world in many different industries. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about a few of the big active users of OpenStack right here in Japan. And so we have a short video clip of something about what Yahoo Japan is doing with OpenStack.
そうですね、もともとインハウスで、作ってたんですけど、仮想化の、プライベートクラウドのシステムを作っていたんですけれども、やはりそのオープンスタックの開発スピードが非常に速いので、そちらの方に切り替えた方が Yahoo Japan としても、得策だろうということで、オープンスタックを使い始めました。そうですね、データセンターライフサイクルマネジメントを行うにあたって、全てのハードウェアを抽象化しないといけないと思っています。で、どうやって抽象化するかというところなんですけど、オープンスタックを使って全てのハードウェアを抽象化する、そういった取り組みができれば、その抽象化されたオープンスタッククラスター間でマイグレーションができるんじゃないかと考えています。
So I think you can see that Yahoo Japan faced a very similar situation to a lot of companies. They were building something in-house. They probably evaluated some off-the-shelf box software, which, as I said, I fundamentally believe you can't buy strategic from a box, but you can join a community of people who are solving a similar problem. And they looked at OpenStack and saw that there was a huge community with over 1,000 contributors from over 170 companies that were trying to solve a similar problem. And they could come in, test it, contribute, become an active user, and actually end up with a much more powerful platform. Not just today as they're rolling it out, and as they mentioned in the video, by the end of this year, it's going to be managing, I think, 50,000 instances, a huge part of their infrastructure. But really in the future, and being part of a community that's building software means that you're helping to drive the direction, but you're getting the benefits of all the other people that are also involved. And it really is about users and vendors, not just one or the other. And the lines are blurring between what is a customer and what is a user and what is a vendor. I think ultimately there's a common problem that needs to be solved in the cloud computing world about how we manage huge data centers of compute, storage, and networking. And because it's a big part of how industries are being disrupted, I think it's vitally important that we have an open solution to that problem and that we don't end up with one company dominating something that is going to affect every industry in the world. And I wanted to mention a few other notable users here in Japan that are becoming more active every day. One is Gree. You're all familiar with Gree? Okay. Hopefully you're not playing their games during the keynote, but maybe you can play them later. But they're going to be speaking tomorrow. So a good example of an engaged user is active. They're coming to an event like this, talking about their deployment, sharing that information, and meeting with other users and vendors. So they have a talk tomorrow. I encourage you to go see that. GMO, the hosting provider here in Japan, has an OpenStack-powered cloud called Konoha. Trying to get that right. Konoha? Does that sound right? Okay. And of course, the NII, or National Institute of Informatics, they've been involved in OpenStack for quite a while, and they have an R&D cloud. And if you went back to that large list of users who are contributing to OpenStack, you'd see a lot of academic and research and government entities that have been very engaged in OpenStack early on. And it's because it's such a general purpose tool for solving so many different problems that it's natural that government agencies and organizations will come together and be part of it. And if it's not obvious already, in OpenStack, as a community, we are very much embracing the active user movement. Might seem a little scary to people who are used to business as usual, product management, building software, releasing it into the market, and revising it every 3 years. But I don't think that that's the future of how software is going to be built or where the money is going to be made in the ecosystem. I believe that the most successful companies are going to be the ones that partner with these active users. And I think it's absolutely in OpenStack's best interest for us to find as many users as we can, help them be part of how the software gets written, and break down the walls between what would be considered a consumer and a producer of software. I think we saw in the internet age, with social media, Twitter, Facebook, Weibo, all these social tools, the idea of who's consuming and who's producing content, that went out the window years ago. It's anybody who's consuming can be producing. And that's the way we engage online, socially, but I think it's also the way software is going to be written more and more. And just to give a few specific examples of the tools available to users who want to become active, I mentioned that we have user surveys. They're going on all the time, but we do take a particular window of time leading up to each summit to make sure that we get a snapshot of what users want OpenStack to be, and we talk that through with the project technical leads I'll talk about in a minute, who make a lot of the decisions day to day about what goes into OpenStack. So this is a way to get engaged today. We're starting to see operators. By operator, I mean the people who are actually operating an OpenStack cloud, who have that experience, organize unique events. First one of those is coming up in the next few weeks. I expect that will become a bigger trend. There's a user's guide to how to use OpenStack that was written by users of OpenStack. And of course, those summits I mentioned that happen twice a year, we very much encourage our users to come and tell their stories there. Many of them are involved in our keynotes. And again, just to emphasize the importance of these summits, the next one is in May in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US. And then in November, we will be having another summit in Paris. So if you've been wanting to go to Atlanta or Paris, this is a good excuse. Hope you all will take the opportunity, if you can, to come to one of those summits and get engaged. So one of the questions that we get, probably more than any other, for people that are kind of interested in OpenStack and trying to figure out what's hype and what's real and how things actually happen in this messy world where users actually help write the software. It's kind of a crazy upside down thing to a lot of people. They find it a little bit unique. And we feel like we've really found a model that works for us. I don't know whether other large software projects that are strategic to so many companies will follow this model. We certainly learned from and drafted off a lot of ideas from other open source projects, so we didn't invent all these concepts, but having elected leaders who we call PTLs, if you hear that term, it means project technical lead. Those are people who can make decisions every single day about what's going in or out of an OpenStack project or component within the OpenStack cloud platform. And so it's very important, as you have a huge ecosystem, a lot of stakeholders, to still have people ultimately that can make a decision, that are empowered to do that. So we're not bogged down by the size of the community. We're actually, emboldened by it. It's the energy that drives OpenStack forward. There are a lot of PTLs. I just listed 3 of them here just to give you an example of how important the people are who actually do this work. We like to look at the process and the model, but the reality is it's about who the leaders are and how they step up to make OpenStack successful that counts. And these are 3 of the compute, storage, and block storage and networking PTLs. We do release the software every 6 months. I mentioned before that after a new release comes out, then we go to a summit to discuss what to put in the next one. I believe that this is very important in a world where you have lots of people involved who have a lot of opinions, to have set deadlines when you have a release. So this is a fast release cycle, but there are even ways you can look at OpenStack on the daily basis and see the trunk, as it's called, of OpenStack that changes every single day. And there are milestone releases about once a month in between. But most users think about OpenStack in the 6-month cadence. We think it's really critical to making sure that we're always making steady progress. Talked a lot about the active users. I think the automated testing is probably one of the pieces that is people don't know a lot about in terms of how OpenStack gets made. But when you have over 1,000 developers all over the world contributing code on a regular basis, that could certainly be chaos if you didn't have a good system. But we have very thorough testing. Every single piece of code that comes in must pass certain tests before it can be included or it's rejected. We have a code review system called Garrett, which was created by some folks at Google. It's used by the Android project. How many of you have an Android phone? Yeah. So we like to think of OpenStack as a little bit of Android for the data center. We use some of the same tools they use. And we also have a tool called Jenkins, which manages tests. And we literally can use up to 1,000 virtual machines in a day just testing the new pieces of code, new features that are coming in to make sure nothing breaks before it's added. So that's a massive scale. I think very few companies for their own internal software test at that level of rigor or with that big of an infrastructure. And certainly in open source, it's quite unusual, but very critical. And last but not least, it's egalitarian, meaning anyone who wants to come in can start contributing. Now, their code quality has to be high, and there's a lot of eyes on that to make sure that it meets the standard in terms of the humans that are looking at the code and the code review process, as well as the automated tests. But there's no special club that you have to be in to contribute to OpenStack. And this goes back to that active user idea. The barrier to a user saying, this software meets my needs, except it needs this one other thing, they can contribute to that. They can also hire a company to do that. We also see this quite frequently with many companies in the ecosystem are hired by users to add a feature they need. And that's another way in which the lines are blurred between what you would normally think of as a buyer and a seller in the software world. And this is just one way of looking at the progress that's been made in terms of the lines of code. This graph is a little out of date. It just goes through 2013. But in the first 3 years, we went from 10,000 lines of code to now we're, I believe, over 2 million lines of code. So it's very rapid amount of progress that's been made. But we've been able to keep the quality improving along the way because of all those automated tests. And so in closing, I would just say that if you believe, as I do, that software is strategic to your company, I believe it's strategic to every company. Some piece of software, it may not be all the software your company runs, but there's something that the company is building that affects users, that creates value, that makes you a more valuable company to your customers, then I would encourage you to become an active user, like the many users who I highlighted earlier. Change your industry, much like they are. And I think that your company's future depends on it. And so I would hope that everybody would take the option to get involved, get engaged, and help build the software that you're relying on to run your business. Thank you very much.
マーク・コリアー様、ありがとうございました。